Hey everyone, my name's Luke. I'm an editor at Blister, and today we are talking about the Ibis Ripley AF. Now, me and several of our reviewers have been spending a lot of time on this bike over the past few months and comparing it to a bunch of options. And normally what we do is write a really long, really honest, in-depth review, and we will do that for this bike. But for the people who just want to hear the highlights, the basic elements of what makes this bike stand out, we're doing this sort of long-term, short-form review. Now, to keep things brief, we're just going to go over the highlights. First, what is the Ripley AF? Second, what makes it stand out from the competition? And third, what sort of riders should be considering this bike? Now, for starters, what is the Ripley AF? Well, the Ripley name has been in Ibis's lineup for many years now. The current version has 120 millimeters of rear travel paired with a 130 millimeter fork. It's designed to be their shorter travel trail bike, and in the past, for a long time, it was only available in carbon fiber and generally higher end builds. What they did with the Ripley AF version, the AF stands for aluminum frame, so this one's a little bit heavier, a little bit cheaper, but designed to do the same sort of things that the much more expensive carbon version is supposed to. Now, aside from frame material, the big difference between the Ripley AF and the standard carbon version is that this one costs a whole lot less. This Dior build that we've been testing retails for about $3,200, which is actually basically the same price as the frame-only option of the carbon Ripley. Now, what do you lose? Well, actually, you gain some weight. The frame of the Ripley AF is about 1.5 pounds heavier in equivalent sizes compared to the carbon version. The aluminum frame version of the Ripley also gets a degree slacker head tube angle, and it's available in much lower end budget friendly builds, whereas the carbon version is available with all the top specs parts and the prices to match. So what makes this bike stand out from all the other competitors in that shorter travel trail category? The first thing is the price. We just alluded to it. You get a lot of bang for your buck with the Ripley AF. Since it shares a lot in common with the more expensive version, you're still getting the really nice proven DW Link suspension platform, and the builds available are a pretty good balance of price and performance. Now, on that note about the DW Link suspension design, that's another standout feature of this bike. If you've ever tried a DW Link bike, you know that they pedal quite well, and combined with the shorter travel design of the Ripley AF, that makes it extremely efficient on the ups. Even despite that heavier aluminum frame and build, it still feels like a very efficient bike that makes longer climbs and more rolling terrain a lot more enjoyable than some of the longer travel or more descending oriented options out there. Speaking of that, there are bikes in this travel category such as the Banshee Phantom that feel pretty inclined to go downhill fast despite not having a lot of travel. And then there are the much more expensive carbon versions that feel much more like purebred cross-country bikes. The Ripley AF sort of sits in the middle. It's got pretty modern but not extreme geometry, and it still has a very efficient pedaling platform, and all of that adds up to a particularly versatile bike, especially if you appreciate something that doesn't feel really wallowy on the pedals and that makes that sort of rolling up and down terrain more enjoyable. So, who should be considering the Ripley AF? The first category that comes to mind is people who want a one-bike quiver and they're on a tighter budget. Now, starting at $3,200 for a full build, that's not an insignificant amount of money, but in today's world, it's a really good deal. And if you fall into that category of someone who's looking for one bike to do everything, the Ripley AF should be on your list if you're not typically spending a ton of time in really sustained, steep, and chunky terrain, and you prioritize performance on more rolling terrain, smoother terrain, and you appreciate something that climbs pretty well. It's not that the Ripley AF can't handle the occasional rock garden. It does just fine. We just rode it the other day in the snow, weirdly, on August 20th on the 401 trail here in Crested Butte. And I think that's a great example of a trail where this bike excels. It's mostly smooth. There's a lot of rolling terrain where you could take advantage of pumping to gain speed. And there's a few rooty and rocky sections. And a bike like this really excels there because you can really utilize the terrain to build speed, and it still feels efficient, but it's not totally overwhelmed when you do encounter something on the steeper, chunkier end of the spectrum. And on that note, a lot of bikes can handle smooth terrain pretty well, but compared to something in the more dedicated cross-country realm, the Ripley AF is definitely worth a look. If you don't want something that focused on the uphill, like I said earlier, it still has the fairly modern geometry and decent build spec, especially for the price, to handle steeper, rougher stuff when you want to do that. Now, the second group of people we think this should work well for is those folks who have longer traveled trail or enduro bike, but who find themselves on mellower terrain pretty frequently and are thinking of adding a second bike to the quiver. This should be especially appealing to those who maybe are not going to be riding this as their primary bike and therefore don't want to spend several thousands of dollars on it, but they still want a good bang for their buck bike that is going to make more mellow terrain and rolling terrain substantially more enjoyable, and especially those longer days compared to many of the longer travel bikes out there. All right, so that is our very brief, long-term, short-form review of the Ibis Ripley AF. Like I said earlier, you can head to blisterreview.com for a much more in-depth, honest review of this bike. We go into all the little details, have several reviewers weighing in, and we do that for a whole bunch of other bikes. So head there if you got some more time to spend, and otherwise stay tuned for more videos.